Introduction. Born into faith, you entered this world with no concept of logic, no facts, no reasoning, no mental calculations. You didn't know up from down, danger from safety, or yesterday from today. And yet, you were sustained. You were kept. You were protected, nourished, and carried. Before you ever spoke a word or formed a thought, something deeper guided your existence. You lived from pure faith, because faith was all you had. As a newborn, you didn't question whether your needs would be met. You didn't analyze, strategize, or anticipate. You simply trusted. You trusted the invisible. You trusted the unknown. You trusted without effort, without debate, and without fear. Faith wasn't something you practiced. It was the only state you knew. It was the atmosphere of your being. It was your original nature. But the moment you entered the world, life began teaching you, molding you, and shaping you. With every year, every experience, every correction, every disappointment, and every success, something new began to take form within you, the seed of logic. You were taught to make sense of things. You were taught to question, to verify, to prove, to expect, to prepare, and to protect yourself. And while logic became a valuable tool, something subtle happened beneath the surface. Faith slowly took a back seat. As you grew older, logic made promises of certainty. It told you, "Trust me, I can show you how the world works." It stepped in as a protector, a guide, a ruler. It taught you formulas, systems, patterns, and rules. And because logic seemed to always have evidence, always something it could point to, measure, or explain, you began forming a dominant relationship with it. Logic became the voice you listened to first. Logic became the standard you used to measure possibility. Logic became the filter that determined what you believed you could or could not do. And yet, despite all its structure and facts, logic could never give you what faith once freely supplied: the ability to move without fear, the ability to trust without evidence, the ability to step into the unknown with confidence. There comes a point in every person's life when logic becomes too small for the size of their destiny. A point when the facts no longer match the vision. A point when what you feel inside contradicts what you see outside. And when that moment comes, something begins to whisper within you. Something ancient, something familiar, something that feels like home. Faith begins calling you back. But now, unlike your infancy, you're standing between two worlds, the world of logic and the world of faith. And here's the truth that becomes unavoidable. You cannot serve two masters. Not because Scripture is trying to be poetic, but because your inner world cannot operate from two opposing belief systems at the same time. Logic requires proof. Faith requires imagination. Logic needs guarantees. Faith creates guarantees. Logic waits for evidence. Faith produces evidence. So the question becomes, which one will lead you? This book is about that journey. The journey from being born in faith to being trained by logic, to rediscovering the power you lost, the power to believe without restriction. You will explore how logic, although helpful, becomes a limitation when you allow it to be your master. Logic can calculate, but it cannot create. It can count resources, but it cannot multiply them. It can measure the present, but it cannot reveal the future. Logic deals with what is. Faith deals with what will be. Somewhere along your path, you were taught to trust logic over faith because logic made sense. It felt reliable, safe, predictable. But predictable outcomes will never lead you to extraordinary results. Every great leap in your life, the moments that changed everything, came from faith, not logic. Logic explained your steps, but faith is what pushed you forward. This book is your invitation back to your original state, the state where vision leads, not circumstances, where your inner knowing becomes stronger than outer evidence. You're not here to abandon logic. Logic has its place. You're here to dethrone logic from ruling your life and return it to its rightful position, a servant to faith. When faith leads, your world expands. When logic leads, your world shrinks. Faith was the first language you ever spoke. Faith was your first instinct. Faith is your natural state. This journey brings you home to yourself. Chapter 1. The Innocence of Pure Faith. Before the world ever had the chance to teach you limitations, you lived in a state of effortless trust. You didn't question whether you would be fed. You didn't wonder if someone would pick you up when you cried. You didn't analyze the hands that held you or the voice that comforted you. You simply rested in a deep, unshakable assurance that your needs would be met. This wasn't learned, it was innate. It was the innocence of pure faith. As a child, you lived from the inside out. Your imagination didn't ask permission. It didn't wait for circumstances. You believed everything was possible simply because you hadn't yet been convinced otherwise. You saw things not as they were, but as they could be. A blanket became a cape. A cardboard box became a spaceship. A backyard became a kingdom. You didn't doubt your visions. You lived in them. The world had no boundaries in your mind. You didn't calculate risks. You didn't consider what others thought. You didn't measure outcomes or weigh consequences. You believed first and experienced later. You acted from pure desire, not from fear or analysis. That innocence, unfiltered, unconditioned, unrestrained, was the essence of faith before logic stepped in. Think about it. A baby doesn't sit in the crib wondering if crying will work. It never thinks, "Let me gather evidence to support this request." Its entire world operates through assumption. It assumes care. It assumes love. It assumes provision. It assumes connection. And because that assumption is so natural, so pure, so unconcerned with proof, it is answered. This is the mystery adults often forget. Faith works the strongest when proof is the weakest. In the early stages of life, you weren't limited by your environment because you hadn't been trained to believe in limits. You didn't know scarcity. You didn't know fear. You didn't know doubt. These were not part of your original vocabulary. They were taught, reinforced, and slowly accepted through repetition. But in your original state, you were bold, enough to believe without hesitation. You trusted the unseen without conflict. You embraced possibility without negotiation. This innocence is not weakness. It is the highest form of spiritual power. It allows you to operate in the same creative way you were designed to function. As you grew, people around you, parents, teachers, society, began shaping your understanding of the world. They weren't trying to limit you. They were simply passing along what they knew. But in doing so, they introduced you to the concept of realism, a word often used to disguise fear. Be realistic became the silent killer of creativity. Be careful became the slow erosion of courage. Think it through replaced trust yourself. And little by little, innocence was traded for logic. Yet in that innocence, you were closest to the truth of who you are. You were closest to your divine nature. You were closest to the creative power within you. You were closest to God, not as an external being, but as the invisible intelligence that supports life itself. Children don't struggle to believe in things they cannot see. They accept the invisible easily. They understand possibility instinctively. This is why Scripture says, "Except you become as little children," because children do not divide the world into logical and illogical. They simply accept that the unseen is just as real as the seen. Your faith as a child wasn't religious. It was experiential. It was lived, not learned. It was expressed through your ability to imagine without boundaries. Before anyone told you what was impossible, you lived without the concept of impossibility altogether. That is the power the world slowly trains out of you. But here is the hidden truth. Innocent faith never leaves you. It only gets buried beneath logic. Deep within you is the same child who once believed effortlessly, the same mind that once imagined without fear, the same heart that trusted without evidence, the same spirit that moved without hesitation. That part of you isn't gone. It's simply been overshadowed by years of logical conditioning. But innocence holds a wisdom that logic cannot touch. Innocence sees the world as open. Innocence moves freely. Innocence expects good. Innocence trusts its inner voice. Innocence responds to desire without debating it. Innocence doesn't wait for permission to dream. It assumes the dream is already valid. Faith, in its purest form, is not complicated. It's not a technique. It's not a method. It's not a ritual. It's a return to the way you originally operated before life taught you to doubt. And if you listen closely enough, you can still hear that innocence whispering. Every time you feel drawn to something bigger, every time a vision flashes in your mind, every time something within you says, "There's more for you," every time you feel the desire to expand, create, or rise, faith is resurfacing. Logic will always demand evidence first, but faith speaks in the language of the unseen. It reminds you that you were created to believe, not calculate, to move, not rationalize, to trust, not predict. The innocence you were born with was never meant to be abandoned. It was meant to be matured into conscious faith. That is the purpose of your journey. This chapter returns you to the mindset you had before facts became your master. It reintroduces you to the version of yourself that fear could not influence. It reminds you that before you learned limitation, you lived in unlimited possibility. The innocence of pure faith is not childish. It is divine. And reconnecting with it is the first step in reclaiming the life you were always meant to create. Chapter 2. Experiencing the world. As you stepped beyond infancy and began engaging with the world, something subtle and powerful started happening within you. You began collecting experiences, moments, memories, interactions that shaped how you perceived reality. The world, which once felt open and limitless through the eyes of pure faith, slowly started to introduce boundaries. These boundaries weren't necessarily physical, they were psychological. They came in the form of rules, expectations, and consequences. In the beginning, everything was exploration. You touched everything. You reached for everything. You tasted, climbed, wandered, asked, tried, and tried again. The world was your teacher, and curiosity was your compass. Nothing stopped you from pursuing what interested you. You weren't afraid of being wrong, because wrong was not yet a concept you understood. Every attempt was discovery, not failure. But as you grew, the reactions of others began shaping your internal world. A parent's "no" taught caution. A teacher's correction shaped conformity. A peer's laughter created self-consciousness. Little by little, external responses became internal rules. And without realizing it, you started forming an identity based on feedback. This was the beginning of your relationship with logic. Logic doesn't begin as thought. It begins as interpretation. A child touches a hot stove. The pain becomes logic. A child falls from a small height. The fear becomes logic. A child is told they can't enough times. The limitation becomes logic. Each moment of correction, each disappointment, and each consequence creates a mental association. And those associations eventually become beliefs. The innocence of pure faith starts to shift as the world introduces contrast, pleasure and pain, acceptance and rejection, approval and disappointment. These dualities mold your understanding of what's safe, what's allowed, and what's possible. Faith begins to take a back seat, not because it becomes less real, but because the world becomes louder. The more you experience life, the more you begin developing something essential, the ability to predict outcomes. This is the root of logic. Logic forms itself around the desire to avoid pain and repeat pleasure. It becomes the mind's way of keeping you safe, prepared, and protected. And while this sounds beneficial, it also introduces a major shift. You begin trusting patterns more than possibilities. Children don't think about the future. They live in the present. But the more you experience life, the more you begin to anticipate. Anticipation is the birthplace of logic. You start thinking, if this happened before, it might happen again. And while that mental skill helps in some areas, it also creates limitations in others. Because logic operates from memory. Faith operates from imagination. Every experience you encounter becomes a reference point. Your mind begins building a library of what life has shown me so far. And if those experiences include disappointment, failure, struggle, or rejection, your logic begins forming a worldview around those memories, convincing you that they define what is possible. This is how logic gains power, through repetition. The more life reinforces a pattern, the more you begin to trust it. Not because it's absolute truth, but because it's familiar. But here's the hidden flaw in that process. Logic is built on what has been, not on what can be. The world teaches you to trust the past more than your potential. It teaches you to rely on outcomes you've already seen, instead of imagining outcomes you've never experienced. This is the moment where faith becomes quiet. Not gone, just quiet. As you experienced the world, you began noticing cause and effect. You learned that effort leads to reward, mistakes lead to consequences, and consistency leads to results. These are valuable lessons, but they also began rewriting your mental script. They taught you that everything must be earned, justified, explained, or proven. And in this shift, you lost something sacred, the freedom to believe without evidence. When you were a child, you didn't need proof to believe something was possible. You simply felt it and acted on it. But the more experiences you collected, the more you began demanding evidence before action. This is where logic began to dominate your inner world. In school, you learned facts. In relationships, you learned boundaries. In society, you learned expectations. In setbacks, you learned caution. And all these lessons formed a system, one designed to protect you, but not designed to free you. Because logic prioritizes safety. Faith prioritizes expansion. The world conditions you to live small for the sake of being safe. It conditions you to avoid risks, avoid uncertainty, and avoid failure. But avoiding uncertainty also means avoiding possibility. You can't experience miracles while living inside the comfort zone of logic. As your experiences grow, so does your attachment to what seems predictable. Logic whispers, stay where it makes sense. Faith whispers, move where it doesn't. And everyone, at some point, must decide which voice they will follow. But remember this, experiencing the world is not the problem. The problem arises when your experiences become prisons, when they dictate your identity, your potential, and your future. When you believe that what happened before must happen again. This is the illusion logic creates, and the illusion faith is designed to break. Your experiences were meant to teach you, not limit you. They were meant to inform you, not define you. They were meant to shape your wisdom, not shrink your faith. When you experienced the world as a child, you absorbed everything. But as an adult, you must learn to choose what you keep and what you release. Logic has its place. It offers structure, understanding, and clarity. But it must not become your master. Because if logic is the only filter through which you interpret life, then your future can never be bigger than your past. This chapter is the bridge between your original state of pure faith and the conditioned state of learned logic. It explains how experience slowly shifts your reliance from intuition to reasoning, from imagination to memory, from possibility to predictability. But the story doesn't end here. Because just as the world taught you logic through repetition, you have the power to reawaken faith through awareness. You can reclaim the freedom you once had, the freedom to believe, to trust, to imagine, to step without seeing the entire staircase. Experiencing the world didn't take faith away from you. It simply covered it. And now, piece by piece, you're uncovering it again. Chapter 3. The Birth of Logic. Logic does not appear in your life as a sudden event. It is not something you wake up with one morning, fully formed. Instead, logic is born slowly, quietly, and subtly, assembled piece by piece as your mind collects patterns, consequences, and explanations for how the world seems to work. It is learned, not inherited. It is acquired, not divine. Logic enters your life as a response to the world outside of you, while faith is the language of the world inside of you. The birth of logic begins the moment you discover contrast. When an experience doesn't match your expectation, your mind begins asking questions. You learn that certain actions bring comfort, while others bring pain. You discover that choices have consequences, that behavior affects outcomes, and that the world does not always bend to your desires as effortlessly as it once did in childhood. This is where logic begins its ascent. At first, logic seems harmless, innocent even. A child touches a hot surface. The pain becomes a memory, and memory becomes logic. A child runs too fast and falls. The fear becomes logic. A child is told repeatedly what is possible and what is not. The limitation becomes logic. Logic grows out of your attempt to navigate the world safely. It promises predictability, control, and structure. And because the world rewards being right, logic begins to feel like the wiser teacher. This is the moment where faith starts to shift. Faith, once your dominant instinct, now begins to be replaced by logic's evidence-based reasoning. You start learning through observation rather than imagination. Instead of assuming the best, you begin anticipating the likely. Instead of trusting your inner voice, you begin relying on external information. But here's the irony. Logic is always rooted in the past. Every logical conclusion is built on something that has already happened. Logic can never see beyond what has been observed. It can only replicate experience, never transcend it. And yet, because logic seems reliable, it begins to feel like truth. The birth of logic becomes fully established when you start valuing facts over feelings. You begin believing that something is possible only if you've seen it done. You start measuring dreams through the lens of probability. You evaluate choices through risk instead of desire. You trust data over intuition, reasoning over revelation. Your world begins shrinking to the boundaries of what you can explain. Logic convinces you that safety is found in certainty. Faith knows that certainty is found in trust. During this stage of life, you begin forming your identity around what you think you know. You build routines, beliefs, habits, and assumptions based on your growing understanding of how life seems to operate. You learn what earns praise and what invites criticism. You learn what behaviors bring acceptance and which ones cause rejection. Over time, your logic creates a self-image, one that appears stable, but is often built on very narrow evidence. This is where many people unknowingly lose access to their creative power. Not because faith disappears, but because logic becomes louder. The birth of logic ushers in a subtle but powerful shift. You begin believing that what you see determines what is possible. But faith works in the opposite direction. Faith determines what you see. Faith creates outcomes that logic cannot anticipate. Faith moves beyond explanation, beyond evidence, beyond reason. And yet once logic is born, you start prioritizing what feels realistic. But realism is often just a polite word for fear. Logic becomes the gatekeeper of your potential, allowing only what fits its limited framework to come through. Anything outside of that framework is dismissed as impossible, impractical, or irrational. Here's the truth. Logic is useful, but it is not meant to lead you. Logic is a servant, not a master. A tool, not a ruler. A guideline, not a law. Logic helps you navigate the physical world, but it should never dictate your spiritual one. The spiritual realm, the realm of imagination, desire, intuition, and vision, does not operate by logic. It operates by belief. And this is why the birth of logic, if left unchecked, disconnects you from the part of yourself that is limitless. Once logic becomes your master, you stop dreaming boldly. You stop thinking expansively. You stop moving into the unknown. You stop trusting desires that don't make sense yet. You start shrinking your life to what feels predictable, practical, manageable. But the truth is, everything extraordinary in your life, every breakthrough, every blessing, every manifestation, will always be born from faith, not logic. Logic can explain how you got where you are. Faith reveals where you can go next. This chapter marks the turning point in your internal evolution. The birth of logic is not the death of faith. It is simply the moment when faith becomes challenged, the moment where two inner voices begin to emerge. One voice whispers, "This is what you've seen." The other whispers, "This is what's possible." You now stand between the two. Logic is growing, but faith has not gone anywhere. It still lives beneath the surface, waiting for you to remember the power you once used so naturally as a child. The birth of logic introduces structure into your mind, but it also introduces doubt. It explains outcomes, but it also restricts imagination. It protects you, but it also limits you. This is where the internal conflict begins. The tug of war between the comfort of certainty and the call of possibility. But remember this, faith existed first. Faith is your original language. Faith is your native frequency. Logic came later, and because of that, it should never be allowed to rule the part of you that was born from divinity. The birth of logic was inevitable, but the return to faith must be intentional. Chapter 4. Learning to trust the mind. As logic continued forming in your life, a new relationship began to emerge, your relationship with your own mind. Up to this point, your mind was a receiver of experience. It absorbed everything without question. But as you grew older, the mind transformed into something much more active. It became a commentator, a judge, a predictor, a protector. It learned to analyze, categorize, calculate, and conclude. Trusting the mind meant trusting its interpretations. And as your experiences grew, so did your mind's confidence in its evaluations. It began telling you what was possible, what was safe, what was realistic, and what outcomes you should expect. This internal voice, shaped by experience and strengthened by repetition, began guiding your decisions. But here is the truth. Your mind learned how to think, but it never learned how to believe. Logic governs thought. Faith governs belief. And the mind, once it becomes dominated by logic, stops trusting anything it cannot measure. The inner world, the realm of intuition, imagination, desire, and divine insight, becomes secondary to what the mind can explain. You begin relying on thoughts more than on feelings, on facts more than on intuition, on evidence more than on possibility. This is where you begin learning the most subtle tension. The logical mind protects you, but faith leads you. The mind doesn't like uncertainty. It doesn't like the unknown. It doesn't like leaps. It doesn't like steps without guaranteed outcomes. This is why, as people age, they often retreat into predictability, not because their faith is gone, but because they no longer trust their inner knowing more than their external logic. And yet, some of the greatest breakthroughs in history came from people who dared to trust their inner world over the logic of their time. This is where the story of the Wright brothers beautifully enters the conversation. The Wright brothers, a masterclass in faith over logic. In the early 1900s, logic insisted that human flight was impossible. Not improbable, impossible. Every expert, every scientist, every engineer declared it could not be done. The logic of the world was clear. Humans were too heavy, engines were too weak, air resistance was too strong, and nature simply did not design humans to fly. But the Wright brothers weren't guided by logic. They were guided by vision. While the world demanded proof, they trusted an unseen knowing within themselves. Their minds did not begin with evidence. They began with belief. They believed flight was possible before logic had any reason to agree. They trusted the internal image long before the external world offered confirmation. This is faith. Faith is not ignoring logic. It is seeing beyond it. Orville and Wilbur had no educational advantage, no scientific acclaim, no financial backing, no widespread support. But they possessed what most people lose as they grow older, belief that isn't intimidated by impossibility. Logic said, man cannot fly. Faith said, what if you can? Logic demanded proof. Faith supplied imagination. They experimented again and again, facing failure after failure. Not because they doubted, but because they trusted the process. Every setback taught them something. Every miscalculation guided them closer. Their faith didn't weaken in the presence of logic, it strengthened. And on December 17th, 1903 at Kitty Hawk, they did what logic declared impossible. The world witnessed the moment when faith rewrote reality. The Wright brothers didn't just build a flying machine, they demonstrated a universal truth. Logic teaches you what is. Faith teaches you what can be. Their achievement became a monumental example of the creative power of belief. Flight was not born from logic. It was born from imagination, intuition, persistence, vision, and a willingness to trust the unseen. They proved that the mind, when guided by faith, can produce outcomes that defy the most rigid logic. They proved that faith is not foolish. It is foundational. The greatest advancements in human history come not from logic alone, but from those who trust what they feel more than what they see. Your own mind, the battlefield between two masters. Learning to trust your mind is not about trusting its fears. It's about trusting its inner knowing. The mind has two voices. 1. The logical voice, formed from memory and experience. 2. The intuitive voice, formed from faith and divine insight. Most people only listen to the first. The logical mind says, play it safe. Faith says, rise higher. The logical mind says, you've never done that before. Faith says, every miracle begins with the unknown. The logical mind says, the odds are against you. Faith says, the odds don't matter. When you learn to trust your mind correctly, you don't trust the version shaped by fear. You trust the version guided by faith. You trust the voice within that sees possibilities no one else sees. You trust the whisper that encourages you toward expansion, even when the surface-level logic disagrees. Just like the Wright brothers, you learn that belief is not about having all the answers. It's about following the inner pull that refuses to be quiet. The evolution of internal trust. As you mature spiritually, something begins shifting. You start recognizing that your logical mind is not your enemy. It is simply incomplete. Logic offers structure, but not destiny. It offers explanation, but not innovation. It offers safety, but not fulfillment. When faith leads, logic becomes a tool, instead of a barrier. Your mind becomes something you use, not something you obey. You begin to trust your desires again. You begin to trust your intuition again. You begin to trust the vision that comes to you uninvited. You begin to trust the feeling that says, this path is yours. This is the reawakening of the inner child, the one who believed naturally, moved instinctively, and acted without fear. Just as the Wright brothers trusted their inner knowing, you also must return to the voice within that sees beyond circumstance. You must learn to follow the mind that is connected to your divine identity, not the mind shaped solely by earthly experience. Because when you trust the right part of your mind, the impossible becomes possible again. Chapter 5. Facts become our master. There comes a point in your life when the world's teachings become louder than your inner truth. You begin collecting enough experiences, enough outcomes, enough disappointments, and enough observations that facts start feeling like the most trustworthy guide. Facts become familiar. Facts feel safe. Facts become the standard by which you measure possibility. And slowly, almost without noticing, facts become your master. This is the moment when many people stop living and start calculating. When you were a child, faith was your compass. You believed before seeing. You acted before analyzing. You trusted without reason. But as logic took hold and experiences accumulated, you began leaning on what could be proven. You stopped trusting the unseen and became dependent on the seen. Facts began dictating what you believed you could achieve. And here's the hidden danger. Facts only describe the world you've already accepted. Facts cannot imagine. Facts cannot create. Facts cannot expand. Facts cannot see beyond themselves. Yet facts have a persuasive power. They convince you they are universal truth, when in reality, they are simply the result of past observations. Facts are not the limit of what is possible. They are the limit of what has already happened. But because facts are tangible, measurable, and widely accepted, people begin to worship them. They allow facts to define their identity, their potential, and their future. They surrender their imagination to the authority of information. They stop dreaming boldly because the facts don't support it. This is where your internal relationship with logic shifts from guidance to domination. What began as a tool becomes a tyrant. Your mind begins telling you what is realistic. Others reinforce what is practical. Society rewards what is predictable. And slowly, faith, your original power, fades into the background. Yet every great breakthrough in history required someone to challenge the so-called facts. When facts claimed flight was impossible. Before the Wright brothers lifted off the ground in 1903, the facts of the time were stacked firmly against them. Every expert in the world insisted heavier-than-air machines could not fly. It wasn't just an opinion, it was a declared scientific fact. The facts said, human flight is physically impossible. No engine is strong enough. Air resistance is too powerful. Lift cannot overcome weight. Nature did not design humans to fly. These conclusions were not casual assumptions. They were the consensus of the most brilliant minds of the era. But facts are powerless in the presence of faith. The Wright brothers understood something deep. Facts are not final. They are simply early drafts. They didn't argue with the experts. They simply declined to accept the limitation. They believed in something that the facts insisted could not exist. And that belief is what gave birth to invention. Faith allowed them to see beyond data. And when the world watched them rise into the air that December morning, the facts crumbled. Human flight did not become possible on the day the plane lifted off the ground. It became possible on the day someone refused to bow to the facts. This is the truth most people never realize. Facts change every time faith pushes further. What is called impossible today becomes common knowledge tomorrow. What is unrealistic becomes historic. What is illogical becomes innovation. Facts do not define the boundaries of the world. Faith does. How facts turn into chains. As you grow older, you begin to internalize facts as limitations. You tell yourself, based on the facts, this is all I can earn. Based on the facts, people like me don't succeed in that way. Based on the facts, it's too late to start over. Based on the facts, this dream is unrealistic. But these facts are not universal truths. They are conclusions drawn by a version of you who forgot their faith. Facts become your master when you allow evidence to outweigh desire. You allow probability to override possibility. You allow fear to disguise itself as practicality. You allow the past to control your future. This is not intelligence. It is spiritual amnesia. You were not born to be limited by information. You were born to transform it, to challenge it, to transcend it, to expand what people believe is possible. But when facts become your master, your imagination becomes your prisoner. You start thinking small to avoid being wrong. You start shrinking dreams to match your circumstances. You start adjusting goals to fit your history. This is how people lose themselves, not because facts are evil, but because they forget that facts serve a purpose, not a destiny. The purpose of facts. Facts are not meant to lead you, only inform you. Their job is to describe what has happened, not dictate what can happen. Facts are the ground you start from, not the ceiling you live under. When faith leads, facts follow. The Wright brothers didn't deny the facts. They simply refused to let the facts decide what was possible. They treated facts as data, not destiny. The facts told them what wasn't working, but faith told them not to stop. Facts shaped their strategy, but faith fueled their purpose. This is the relationship you were designed to have with facts. Use them to improve, not imprison. Use them to guide, not govern. Use them to adjust, not abandon. Use them to refine, not restrict. Facts are servants of the mind. Faith is the master of creation. Returning to the right master. When facts become your master, you lose touch with your divine nature. You start living a life of limitation. You begin expecting only what the world says is possible. You unconsciously bow to the god of probability instead of the source of possibility. But you cannot serve two masters. You must choose, will you follow the god of facts or the god of faith? One will keep you safe, the other will set you free. This chapter is your reminder that facts are not your identity. They are not your fate. They are not the measure of your worth or the limit of your potential. They are merely snapshots of what has been. Nothing more. The moment you reclaim faith as your master, the facts of your life begin to shift. Reality bends. Circumstances rearrange. Doors open. Paths appear. And like the Wright brothers, you begin rising above what everyone else believes is impossible, because facts bow to those who walk in faith. Chapter 6. The Illusion of Safety and Logic. Logic promises safety. It promises stability, predictability, and protection from the unknown. The mind convinced by logic believes that it can avoid disappointment by avoiding risk, avoid failure by avoiding faith, and avoid pain by avoiding possibility. This creates the greatest trap of the human experience, the illusion that logic offers security. But here's the truth. Logic offers comfort, not safety. Faith offers expansion, not danger. Most people mistake comfort for safety, and they mistake discomfort for danger. But comfort can kill dreams, and discomfort is often the birthplace of destiny. Logic tries to keep you where you are, because it can only work with what it knows. It cannot guide you into anything that is unfamiliar, because unfamiliar territory is outside logic's jurisdiction. Logic cannot predict miracles. Logic cannot anticipate breakthroughs. Logic cannot map out destiny. This is why logic tells you to stay where it's comfortable. This is why logic encourages you to repeat your past. This is why logic tries to shrink your vision to match your experiences. Logic creates a cage, but it disguises that cage as a fortress. The mind's false promise. When logic takes over your inner world, it begins whispering subtle lies. Don't aim too high. You might get hurt. Don't dream too big. It might not work. Don't step out. You might fail. Be realistic. Stay where it's safe. Don't believe until you see proof. These thoughts feel protective, but what they truly protect is your current reality, not your potential. Logic makes you believe that faith is dangerous. Logic makes you believe that imagination is irresponsible. Logic makes you believe that risk is failure waiting to happen. But faith knows the truth. Risk is the birthplace of reward. The unknown is where miracles live. The impossible becomes possible only when someone is willing to step beyond the limits of logic. The Wright brothers refused the illusion. The Wright brothers understood this better than most. If they had stayed safe, the world would have never seen a flying machine. If they trusted logic. Alone, they would have stuck to building bicycles, the safe, predictable, reasonable business they already mastered. Logic told them, "You're not engineers. You don't have degrees. No one has ever flown, so why should you?" And yet they stepped out anyway. They risked failure. They risked ridicule. They risked wasting time, money, and effort. They risked the certainty of staying where life was comfortable. But faith sees what logic cannot. Their willingness to step outside the illusion of safety is what allowed them to step into destiny. They traded the comfort of the known for the promise of the unseen. And because they dared to trust the invisible, they pulled the impossible into reality. The world called them foolish until they succeeded. Then the world called them geniuses. That is how faith always works. The true danger is staying where you are. Logic will tell you that stepping into the unknown is dangerous, but the true danger, the hidden threat, is staying stagnant. Because stagnation slowly suffocates your dreams, your creativity, and your spiritual power. Remaining in the safety of logic leads to a life that repeats itself, a future shaped entirely by your past, dreams that shrink instead of grow, opportunities that arrive but remain unused, a mind that becomes closed instead of expanded. The only thing logic can guarantee is sameness. Nothing new can be born where nothing new is attempted. Why the illusion is so convincing? Logic feels safe because it uses facts, it uses memory, it uses evidence, it uses probability. It uses what society praises. Faith, on the other hand, uses imagination, intuition, vision, desire, divine insight. Logic speaks to the mind. Faith speaks to the spirit. And because most people live identified with their mind instead of their spirit, they believe the mind's warnings even when their heart knows better. But the mind was never designed to lead. It was designed to follow. Faith is the true leader. Faith is the true guide. Faith is the true master. Faith is not blind. Logic is limited. Most people misunderstand faith. They think faith means ignoring reality. They think faith means bypassing wisdom. They think faith means hoping without foundation. But that is not faith. That is wishful thinking. True faith is not blind. True faith sees clearly, more clearly than logic ever can. Faith sees the future. Faith sees the possibility. Faith sees the outcome before the evidence arrives. Faith sees through the lens of divine potential, not human limitation. Logic, on the other hand, is the one that is blind. It is blind to anything it has not yet experienced. It is blind to miracles. It is blind to breakthroughs. It is blind to innovation. It can only see what has already been done. Faith is visionary. Logic is rear view. Faith is expansive. Logic is restrictive. Faith is creative. Logic is repetitive. Escaping the illusion. To escape the illusion of safety and logic, you must recognize its seductive nature. Logic is comforting because it keeps you within the boundaries of what you can explain. But you were not created to live a life you can explain. You were created to co-create with the divine. The shift happens the moment you stop letting logic dictate your limitations and start letting faith dictate your direction. This doesn't mean you abandon logic. It means you dethrone it. When faith leads and logic follows, you step into your power. When logic leads and faith follows, you step into your prison. Your destiny requires courage. Your expansion requires trust. Your blessing requires movement. Faith will take you where logic refuses to go. A new master arises. The point of this chapter is simple. Logic is a terrible master, but an excellent servant. When you place logic above faith, your life becomes a loop. When you place faith above logic, your life becomes a legacy. The Wright brothers proved that what the world calls safe is often just code for small. Staying where logic is comfortable would have kept humanity grounded forever. But faith Faith lifted us into the skies. And that same faith is what will lift you. Chapter 7. When logic becomes limitation. Logic, on its own, is not the enemy. It is a gift, an instrument designed to help you interpret the world, understand patterns, and move through life with clarity. But when logic becomes the dominant voice, when it becomes the master of your decisions, when it begins to overrule your inner knowing, your intuition, and your faith, logic doesn't just guide you, it limits you. The limitation of logic is subtle. It does not appear as a wall. It appears as common sense. It does not appear as fear. It appears as being realistic. It does not appear as doubt. It appears as the facts. Logic's limitation is often disguised as wisdom, but it is wisdom shaped by past experience, not divine insight. Logic becomes limitation the moment it tells you what you can't do, who you can't be, what you shouldn't try, what is too risky, what is too late, what is impossible. These conclusions do not come from your highest self. They come from the conditioned self, shaped by the world. Logic lives in the past. Logic builds its entire framework on memory. Every conclusion logic makes is rooted in what has already happened. And while that helps you understand patterns, it also restricts your future to the boundaries of your past. If you only expect what you've already seen, you will never rise beyond what you've already lived. Logic cannot imagine. Logic cannot foresee destiny. Logic cannot detect divine timing. Logic cannot grasp spiritual identity. Logic can only calculate what should be possible based on its limited observations. This is why logic becomes dangerous when you give it the authority to determine your potential. Chapter 6. The Illusion of Safety in Logic. Logic promises safety. It promises stability, predictability, and protection from the unknown. The mind convinced by logic believes that it can avoid disappointment by avoiding risk, avoid failure by avoiding faith, and avoid pain by avoiding possibility. This creates the greatest trap of the human experience, the illusion that logic offers security. But here's the truth. Logic offers comfort, not safety. Faith offers expansion, not danger. Most people mistake comfort for safety, and they mistake discomfort for danger. But comfort can kill dreams, and discomfort is often the birthplace of destiny. Logic tries to keep you where you are, because it can only work with what it knows. It cannot guide you into anything that is unfamiliar, because unfamiliar territory is outside logic's jurisdiction. Logic cannot predict miracles. Logic cannot anticipate breakthroughs. Logic cannot map out destiny. This is why logic tells you to stay where it's comfortable. This is why logic encourages you to repeat your past. This is why logic tries to shrink your vision to match your experiences. Logic creates a cage, but it disguises that cage as a fortress. The mind's false promise. When logic takes over your inner world, it begins whispering subtle lies. Don't aim too high. You might get hurt. Don't dream too big. It might not work. Don't step out. You might fail. Be realistic. Stay where it's safe. Don't believe until you see proof. These thoughts feel protective, but what they truly protect is your current reality, not your potential. Logic makes you believe that faith is dangerous. Logic makes you believe that imagination is irresponsible. Logic makes you believe that risk is failure waiting to happen. But faith knows the truth. Risk is the birthplace of reward. The unknown is where miracles live. The impossible becomes possible only when someone is willing to step beyond the limits of logic. The Wright brothers refused the illusion. The Wright brothers understood this better than most. If they had stayed safe, the world would have never seen a flying machine. If they trusted logic. Alone, they would have stuck to building bicycles, the safe, predictable, reasonable business they already mastered. Logic told them, "You're not engineers. You don't have degrees. No one has ever flown, so why should you?" And yet, they stepped out anyway. They risked failure. They risked ridicule. They risked wasting time, money, and effort. They risked the certainty of staying where life was comfortable. But faith sees what logic cannot. Their willingness to step outside the illusion of safety is what allowed them to step into destiny. They traded the comfort of the known for the promise of the unseen. And because they dared to trust the invisible, they pulled the impossible into reality. The world called them foolish until they succeeded. Then the world called them geniuses. That is how faith always works. The true danger is staying where you are. Logic will tell you that stepping into the unknown is dangerous, but the true danger, the hidden threat, is staying stagnant. Because stagnation slowly suffocates your dreams, your creativity, and your spiritual power. Remaining in the safety of logic leads to a life that repeats itself, a future shaped entirely by your past, dreams that shrink instead of grow, opportunities that arrive but remain unused, a mind that becomes closed instead of expanded. The only thing logic can guarantee is sameness. Nothing new can be born where nothing new is attempted. Why the illusion is so convincing? Logic feels safe because it uses facts, it uses memory, it uses evidence, it uses probability, it uses what society praises. Faith, on the other hand, uses imagination, intuition, vision, desire, divine insight. Logic speaks to the mind. Faith speaks to the spirit. And because most people live identified with their mind instead of their spirit, they believe the mind's warnings even when their heart knows better. But the mind was never designed to lead. It was designed to follow. Faith is the true leader. Faith is the true guide. Faith is the true master. Faith is not blind. Logic is limited. Most people misunderstand faith. They think faith means ignoring reality. They think faith means bypassing wisdom. They think faith means hoping without foundation. But that is not faith. That is wishful thinking. True faith is not blind. True faith sees clearly, more clearly than logic ever can. Faith sees the future. Faith sees the possibility. Faith sees the outcome before the evidence arrives. Faith sees through the lens of divine potential, not human limitation. Logic, on the other hand, is the one that is blind. It is blind to anything it has not yet experienced. It is blind to miracles. It is blind to breakthroughs. It is blind to innovation. It can only see what has already been done. Faith is visionary. Logic is rear view. Faith is expansive. Logic is restrictive. Faith is creative. Logic is repetitive. Escaping the illusion. To escape the illusion of safety and logic, you must recognize its seductive nature. Logic is comforting because it keeps you within the boundaries of what you can explain. But you were not created to live a life you can explain. You were created to co-create with the divine. The shift happens the moment you stop letting logic dictate your limitations and start letting faith dictate your direction. This doesn't mean you abandon logic. It means you dethrone it. When faith leads and logic follows, you step into your power. When logic leads and faith follows, you step into your prison. Your destiny requires courage. Your expansion requires trust. Your blessing requires movement. Faith will take you where logic refuses to go. A new master arises. The point of this chapter is simple. Logic is a terrible master, but an excellent servant. When you place logic above faith, your life becomes a loop. When you place faith above logic, your life becomes a legacy. The Wright brothers proved that what the world calls safe is often just code for small. Staying where logic is comfortable would have kept humanity grounded forever. But faith lifted us into the skies. And that same faith is what will lift you. Chapter 7. When Logic Becomes Limitation. Logic, on its own, is not the enemy. It is a gift, an instrument designed to help you interpret the world, understand patterns, and move through life with clarity. But when logic becomes the dominant voice, when it becomes the master of your decisions, when it begins to overrule your inner knowing, your intuition, and your faith, logic doesn't just guide you, it limits you. The limitation of logic is subtle. It does not appear as a wall. It appears as common sense. It does not appear as fear. It appears as being realistic. It does not appear as doubt. It appears as the facts. Logic's limitation is often disguised as wisdom, but it is wisdom shaped by past experience, not divine insight. Logic becomes limitation the moment it tells you what you can't do, who you can't be, what you shouldn't try, what is too risky, what is too late, what is impossible. These conclusions do not come from your highest self. They come from the conditioned self, shaped by the world. Logic lives in the past. Logic builds its entire framework on memory. Every conclusion logic makes is rooted in what has already happened. And while that helps you understand patterns, it also restricts your future to the boundaries of your past. If you only expect what you've already seen, you will never rise beyond what you've already lived. Logic cannot imagine. Logic cannot foresee destiny. Logic cannot detect divine timing. Logic cannot grasp spiritual identity. Logic can only calculate what should be possible based on its limited observations. This is why logic becomes dangerous when you give it the authority to determine your potential. Chapter 8. The Conflict Within. There comes a moment in every person's life when the inner world becomes a battlefield. Two voices, two perspectives, two realities begin tugging in opposite directions. One voice whispers possibility. The other whispers probability. One voice is rooted in faith. The other is rooted in logic. And both want control. This is the conflict within. It is not a conflict between good and evil. It is not a conflict between right and wrong. It is the conflict between who you were born as and who you were conditioned to become. Faith is your original nature. Logic is your acquired nature. Faith speaks from divine identity. Logic speaks from human experience. Faith points you toward destiny. Logic points you toward safety. And as life pulls you upward, the tension between these two masters becomes unavoidable. The birth of inner division. When you were a child, you lived in harmony. Faith was the only voice. You believed effortlessly, imagined freely, trusted without question. There was no conflict because there was no second voice. But as you gathered experiences, failures, fears, judgments, expectations, logic began to form opinions. It began remembering what didn't work. It began cataloging disappointments. It began calculating risk. Now you have two sources of guidance inside you. The voice of faith calling you forward and the voice of logic pulling you back. Every major decision you face becomes a negotiation. Every dream becomes a debate. every desire becomes a dilemma. And this is where the inner war begins, not because either voice is wrong, but because each one leads to a different life. Faith leads to expansion. Logic leads to preservation. Faith leads to destiny. Logic leads to familiarity. Faith leads to miracles. Logic leads to maintenance. So the conflict within is not accidental. It is a sign that you are outgrowing your current level. The Wright brothers faced the same war. The Wright brothers were not simply battling scientific challenges. They were battling themselves. Every single day, during their early experiments, they faced two inner voices. One voice said, "It's possible. Keep going." The other said, "Everyone has failed. Why would you succeed?" Faith would give them a glimpse of man lifting into the sky. Logic would remind them of every past crash, every broken prototype, every public ridicule. Faith said, "This will work." Logic said, "This makes no sense." Some mornings, their vision burned so brightly that quitting wasn't even an option. Other mornings, logic screamed, so loudly that the dream seemed foolish. This is the same tension you face, the vision you feel versus the facts you see, the calling within versus the circumstance around you, the desire for more versus the fear of loss. The Wright brothers succeeded not because the conflict disappeared, but because they chose the right voice to lead them. You cannot serve two masters. Scripture says, you cannot serve two masters. This isn't a warning. It's a revelation of how consciousness works. You cannot follow faith and logic at the same time because they require contradictory actions. Faith requires movement without proof. Logic demands proof before movement. Faith sees the destination. Logic sees the obstacles. Faith says, act now. Logic says, wait until it makes sense. Faith expands your world. Logic confines it. If you try to follow both, your life becomes stuck, motionless, conflicted, stagnant. You will feel pulled, but not progressing, inspired, but not acting, called, but not choosing. The conflict within is not solved by silencing one voice. It is solved by choosing which master you will serve. Logic strategy. Fear. Logic does not limit you by saying no. Logic limits you by introducing fear. Fear of failing. Fear of embarrassment. Fear of rejection. Fear of loss. Fear of being wrong. Fear of stepping into the unknown. Fear is logic's weapon, not because fear is real, but because fear is persuasive. Fear convinces you that staying the same is safer than stepping forward. Fear convinces you that the known is better than the unknown. Fear convinces you that the past predicts the future. Fear is powerful because it sounds reasonable. But reason was never meant to govern destiny. Faith strategy, vision. Faith does not argue with logic. Faith reveals a picture. Faith shows you what could be. Faith shows you the life waiting on the other side of obedience. Faith shows you the version of yourself that exists beyond fear. Faith shows you the future before it becomes visible. Vision is faith's weapon. Not because vision guarantees comfort, but because vision ignites courage. You move not because it's easy, but because something inside you refuses to settle. You move not because everything makes sense, but because something within knows you were made for more. You move not because logic agrees, but because destiny calls your name. Faith does not remove the conflict. Faith makes the conflict irrelevant. The moment of decision. Every spiritual transformation reaches a moment where you must choose your master. Do you follow the part of you that wants safety, or the part of you that wants destiny? Do you follow the part of you shaped by limitation, or the part shaped by divine imagination? Do you follow the voice that fears the unknown, or the voice that created worlds without needing evidence? This is the true conflict within, not between right and wrong, but between smallness and greatness. The turning point comes from awareness. Once you recognize the conflict, you gain power over it. You begin seeing fear for what it is, a protector, not a prophet. You begin seeing logic for what it is, a tool, not a leader. You begin seeing faith for what it is, a guide, not a gamble. The conflict becomes a compass. The tension becomes a sign that you're on the threshold of expansion. The presence of internal conflict does not mean you're off track. It means you are about to make a quantum leap. Resolution through surrender. The conflict ends the moment you surrender to faith, not by dismissing logic, but by putting logic in its rightful place. Let faith lead. Let logic follow. Let vision decide. Let structure support. The Wright brothers didn't eliminate logic. They used it. But they let faith determine the goal. They let vision set the target. They let the unseen guide their steps. And that is exactly how you transcend the conflict within. Chapter 9. The Whisper of Faith Returns. After years of living under the rule of logic, after letting facts dictate your expectations, after letting experience define your identity, after letting fear shape your choices, something begins to stir inside you, quietly, softly, gently, almost imperceptibly. It is not loud. It is not forceful. It is not dramatic. It is a whisper from a place within you that never died, only went silent. A whisper from the part of you that remembers who you were before the world taught you to doubt. A whisper from the deepest core of your being, your original state of faith. This whisper is the beginning of your return. Faith never leaves. It only gets buried. Even when logic becomes your master, even when fear becomes your language, even when doubt becomes your reflex, faith never disappears. Faith is part of your spiritual DNA. It is impossible to remove, impossible to destroy, impossible to silence forever. Faith is your essence. Faith is your birthright. Faith is your original nature. But like a seed, buried under layers of soil, faith gets covered by disappointment, covered by hardship, covered by realistic thinking, covered by the opinions of others, covered by life's demands. And yet, beneath it all, faith waits patiently. It waits for the moment when logic can no longer take you where your soul longs to go. It waits for the moment when the life you've built through reason feels too small for the destiny calling you. It waits for the moment when your vision becomes too big to be supported. By evidence, that's when faith whispers again. It doesn't return with a shout. It returns with a pull. Faith rarely announces itself with thunder. It doesn't confront you with commands. It doesn't interrupt your life with fireworks. Instead, it returns as a subtle tug, a gentle nudge that feels like curiosity, intuition, desire, or possibility. It doesn't push you. It draws you. It says things like, what if there's more? What if you're capable of greater? What if this dream isn't random? What if this desire was put in you for a reason? Faith whispers, not because it is weak, but because it doesn't compete. It leads those who listen, not those who demand certainty. The Wright brothers heard the whisper. Long before the world ever saw an airplane, the Wright brothers were captivated by a whisper. It wasn't an instruction. It wasn't a blueprint. It wasn't a logical plan. It was curiosity. It was fascination. was a question, what if man can fly? No evidence supported this idea. No expert endorsed it. No institution encouraged it. No culture celebrated it. Yet the whisper persisted. It didn't shout. It didn't demand. It didn't justify itself. It simply lingered. And because they listened, history was rewritten. You must understand this. The whisper is always the seed of destiny. Your greatest visions will always arrive quietly, wrapped in subtlety, disguised as desire. Faith returns not to overwhelm you, but to awaken you. The whisper appears when you outgrow your current level. The whisper of faith returns when your life feels too small, not externally, but internally. Something in you says, I can't stay here anymore. This isn't enough. I'm meant for more. The job, the environment, the mindset, the habits, the patterns, they no longer fit. You feel a divine discomfort, not because you're failing, but because you're expanding. Faith whispers, rise, stretch, grow, move, trust. This whisper isn't random. It's recognition. It's the authentic you trying to emerge again. The whisper challenges logic. The moment faith whispers, logic reacts. Logic says, where's the evidence? What if it doesn't work? You've failed before. You're not ready. Be realistic. But faith has no interest in logic's rules. Faith is the language of creation. Faith is the language of possibility. Faith is the language of the unseen. Faith does not explain itself. It expresses itself. The whisper does not give you the entire roadmap. It gives you the next step, the next feeling, the next direction. It invites you forward, not with certainty, but with trust. The whisper is the return of your inner authority. When the whisper of faith returns, something profound happens. You begin reclaiming authority over your own mind. You begin remembering that logic is not your master. You begin remembering that you were designed to create, not just observe. You begin remembering that your imagination is divine intelligence speaking to you. The whisper signals that you are shifting from external influence back to internal leadership. Your life stops being shaped by what you see and begins being shaped by what you feel. You start dreaming again. You start envisioning again. You start believing again. The whisper comes with grace, not pressure. Faith never condemns you for forgetting it. Faith never punishes you for abandoning it. Faith never criticizes you for choosing logic. It simply returns, like a gentle breeze after a long winter, like the first rays of sunlight after a dark night, like the soft hum of a familiar melody you haven't heard in years. Faith returns with grace. It doesn't say, "Why did you forget me?" It says, "I'm still here." It doesn't say, "You should have known better." It says, "Let's begin again." It doesn't say, "You've wasted time." It says, "Watch what I can do with what you have left." Your life changes the moment you listen. The whisper alone does not transform your life. Your response to it does. When you hear it and choose to trust it, your entire world begins reorganizing. Opportunities begin appearing. Ideas begin flowing. People begin showing up. Paths begin opening. Not because faith magically fixes everything, but because faith realigns you with your true identity. You stop living from fear. You stop living from memory. You start living from vision. You start living from courage. You start living from intention. The whisper is the invitation. This chapter marks the beginning of your return to yourself. Faith is no longer silent. Faith is awakening. Faith is calling. Faith is inviting you back to your original design. What you feel rising within you is not random. It is revelation. What you feel drawing you forward is not fantasy. It is destiny. What you feel whispering inside you is not imagination. It is instruction. Faith has returned, and everything in your life is about to shift. The Wright brothers faced logic's limits. The Wright brothers did not simply challenge the logic of their time, they challenged its limitations. At the turn of the 20th century, logic insisted that human flight was absurd. There were mathematical models, expert analyses, scientific papers, and decades of failed attempts that all pointed to the same conclusion. Humans cannot fly. But notice what logic was basing this conclusion on. Past failures, previous limitations, current technology, existing knowledge, the absence of success. Logic could only say it can't be done because it has never been done. That is the limitation. Logic cannot predict what has a precedent. Logic cannot foresee the breakthrough. Logic cannot recognize the miracle. The Wright brothers were not fighting the sky. They were fighting the limits of rational thinking. They could not lean on the logic of the world because the world had no blueprint for what they were creating. They had to lean on something higher. They had to believe in a possibility logic could not validate. They had to trust an inner vision logic could not comprehend. They had to follow an inner knowing logic could not support. They had to move from a level that logic could not calculate. Logic said, impossible. Faith said, watch. Every great leap in human history followed this pattern. Logic denies. Faith declares. And faith wins when someone is bold enough to step beyond the limitations of reason. Logic loses sight of who you really are. You are more than your memories. You are more than your experiences. You are more than your history. You are more than the facts that shaped your past. Logic forgets this because logic can only measure what is physical and observable. It cannot measure desire. It cannot measure vision. It cannot measure calling. It cannot measure divine purpose. Logic can explain your circumstances, but it cannot explain your destiny. When you allow logic to dominate your thinking, you begin lowering your expectations to match your circumstances. You stop asking, what do I desire? And start asking, what seems possible? You stop pursuing the life you feel drawn to and start settling for the life you can rationally justify. Logic becomes limitation the moment it replaces faith as your compass. Logic teaches survival. Faith teaches expansion. Logic keeps you alive. It helps you avoid danger, minimize risk, and maintain stability. But you were not created merely to survive. You were created to expand, to create, to influence, to express, to grow, to manifest. Logic offers survival. Faith offers transformation. Logic teaches caution. Faith teaches courage. Logic teaches repetition. Faith teaches reimagination. Logic teaches reaction. Faith teaches creation. And when you rely solely on logic, you begin living a life that is far too small for the spirit within you. The inner conflict begins. When your desire grows beyond the limits logic has set, you feel internal tension. You sense that something inside you is pulling you higher, but something else inside you keeps warning you to stay where it's safe. That push and pull is not confusion. It is clarity. It is the moment your destiny begins outgrowing your logic. Faith pulls you forward. Logic pulls you backward. You cannot move in both directions. This is why Scripture says, a double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. You cannot serve two masters. You cannot follow logic's limitations and faith's expansions at the same time. You must choose your leader. Transcending logic's limits. Your goal is not to eliminate logic, but to elevate it. Logic is supposed to follow faith, not restrict it. Logic is supposed to support vision, not shrink it. Logic is supposed to help you strategize, not stop you from beginning. When faith leads, logic becomes creative. When logic leads, faith becomes suppressed. The Wright brothers used logic. They studied aerodynamics, mechanics, weather, and wing curvature. But their logic served their faith. Their logic helped refine the vision, not define the vision. That is the correct order. Faith gives you the destination. Logic helps plan the route. Faith shows you the vision. Logic builds the structure. Faith says what is possible. Logic figures out how. Faith leads. Logic follows. You were never meant to be bound by logic. The spirit within you is limitless. The imagination within you is divine. The destiny within you is expansive. But logic tries to confine you to what makes sense, what is comfortable, and what is familiar. If you let logic lead, you will live a small life. If you let faith lead, you will live a supernatural one. This chapter marks the turning point in your inner journey. The moment you recognize that logic is not wrong, but logic is not enough. It is the moment you realize that everything you desire, everything you dream of, everything you feel called to, it all exists beyond the limits of reason. And you must walk by faith, not by sight, to reach it. Chapter 10. Unlearning the Old Master. Once the whisper of faith returns, a new process begins, one that is both liberating and uncomfortable. It is the process of unlearning. Not learning something new, but releasing something old. Letting go of the mental habits, beliefs, assumptions, and fears that logic has woven into your identity. This is the moment where transformation moves from inspiration to reconstruction. Because you cannot fully embrace faith until you dethrone the master that has ruled you for years. Logic conditioned by fear. Logic must be replaced, not resisted. Many people try to resist logic or suppress it, but resistance creates tension. Suppression creates conflict. The goal is not to fight logic, but to replace its authority with something higher. Logic is not the enemy. It simply has the wrong job. Logic is supposed to serve vision, not lead it. Logic is supposed to support faith, not silence it. Logic is supposed to organize ideas, not override intuition. To unlearn the old master is to reassign its role. Faith becomes the leader. Logic becomes the assistant. This shift is subtle, but it changes everything. Unlearning begins with awareness. You cannot unlearn what you have not identified. So the first step in this process is noticing how deeply logic has shaped your behavior. You begin seeing where logic has been running the show. The dreams you talked yourself out of, the opportunities you hesitated on, the relationships you stayed in, the risks you avoided, the ceilings you accepted, the self-talk you rehearsed. When you look closely, you realize that logic has been making decisions for you in the name of being realistic. But realism is often fear wearing a professional outfit. Unlearning requires honesty. It requires you to confront the smallness you adopted. It requires you to question the limitations you normalized. It requires you to expose the beliefs that were never yours to begin with. The Wright brothers had to unlearn too. Before the Wright brothers could build the future, they had to unbuild the past. They had to unlearn the facts that experts declared. They had to unlearn the belief that human flight was impossible. They had to unlearn the logic that said humans were confined to the ground. Their success began the moment they stopped accepting the world's conclusions as their own. Every great innovator must unlearn the old master before they can follow the new one. The Wright brothers didn't succeed because they had more information. They succeeded because they had less limitation. Unlearning isn't about gathering new facts. It's about removing old restrictions. Unlearning is a spiritual cleanse. Think of unlearning as mental detox. You are removing toxic beliefs, outdated narratives, and inherited fears that no longer match the person you are becoming. Consider what happens during a physical detox. The body releases waste, the system resets, energy returns, clarity increases. The same happens spiritually. When you unlearn and your faith strengthens, your intuition sharpens, your confidence grows, your vision clears, your imagination expands, your spirit rises. Unlearning clears space for the divine to speak again. The old master uses familiar weapons. As you begin unlearning, logic will try to reclaim authority. It uses familiar tactics. 1. Doubt. Are you sure this is the right move? 2. Overthinking. Let's analyze this again. And again. 3. Fear of failure. What if you mess this up? 4. Fear of judgment. What will people think? 5. Fear of losing control. Faith feels too unpredictable. These weapons are not personal. They are patterns. They are the conditioned responses of a mind, trained to rely on certainty. But certainty is not your master anymore. Unlearning requires courage. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to move without permission from fear. Courage is the bridge between the old master and the new one. When you take the first step of faith, logic will panic. When you take the second step, logic will negotiate. When you take the third step, logic will fall silent. When you take the fourth step, logic becomes a servant again. Courage reorders your inner kingdom. Unlearning doesn't mean forgetting. To unlearn logic does not mean you forget it. You don't erase knowledge. You reposition it. A person who unlearns doesn't get rid of logic. They elevate themselves above it. For example, you don't forget how to calculate risk. You stop letting risk decide your future. You don't forget the lessons of the past. You stop letting the past predict your destiny. You don't forget facts. You stop letting facts silence faith. Unlearning means understanding the difference between information and identity. Logic informs you. Faith transforms you. The greatest unlearning is reclaiming innocence. The innocence you had as a child is not naivety. It is pure faith. As you unlearn, that innocence starts returning. You begin believing again. You begin trusting again. You begin imagining without censoring yourself. You begin feeling possibilities that logic cannot explain. This innocence is not childish. It is divine. It is the mindset Jesus referred to when he said, "Unless you become like little children." Children do not lead with logic. Children lead with imagination. Children lead with desire. Children lead with faith. Unlearning is not regression. It is restoration. You unlearn by acting, not thinking. Faith is built through movement, not analysis. You unlearn logic every time you take a step without knowing the whole path. Make a decision based on intuition. Follow a vision others don't see. Choose growth over comfort. Say yes to something that scares you. Obey a whisper. Leap before logic approves. Every act of faith weakens the old master. Every moment of courage dethrones logic. Every step into the unknown strengthens your identity. The Wright brothers didn't wait for society to agree, for science to validate, or for logic to approve. They acted. and in their action, logic had no choice but to adjust to their results. The new master emerges through obedience. You become a student of faith, not through intellectual understanding, but through obedience to your inner knowing. Every time you choose vision over evidence, faith grows. Every time you choose intuition over fear, faith strengthens. Every time you choose destiny over doubt, faith leads. The more you unlearn, the lighter you become. The freer you become. The more aligned you become with the person God created you to be. This chapter marks your rebirth. Faith is no longer the whisper. It is becoming the voice. Logic is no longer the leader. It is becoming the tool. You are stepping into a new order. Chapter 11. Choosing faith over facts. Once you begin unlearning the old master, you reach a powerful crossroads, the moment where faith and facts stand before you, each offering a different path, each promising a different outcome. This is not a casual decision. It is not an intellectual exercise. It is not a philosophical idea. It is the turning point of an entire life. Because choosing faith over facts is choosing destiny over history. It is choosing vision over evidence. It is choosing what God is revealing over what the world is reporting. For most people, this is the moment where fear rises the strongest, because facts feel safe. Facts feel reliable. Facts feel solid. Facts feel undeniable. But facts are not absolute. They are temporary. Facts describe reality, but they do not define it. Facts report what is, not what can be. Faith, on the other hand, describes possibility. Faith defines potential. Faith reveals the unseen. Faith points to outcomes no fact can predict. Choosing faith over facts is choosing to live by a higher law. Facts live in the now. Faith lives in the future. Facts exist only in the present moment. They reflect what currently exists. They reflect what is measurable. They reflect what is observable. But they cannot see beyond the moment. Facts cannot imagine. Facts cannot predict breakthrough. Facts cannot anticipate miracles. Facts cannot comprehend divine timing. Faith, however, is built for the future. It sees what is forming, not what is visible. It sees what God is creating, not what the world is reporting. It sees the finished outcome before the process even begins. Facts look at circumstances. Faith looks at destiny. Facts observe. Faith declares. Facts conclude. Faith creates. This is why choosing faith over facts is the doorway to transformation. The Wright brothers chose faith when facts were against them. When the Wright brothers began their journey, every known fact argued against human flight. The facts said, no flying machine had ever worked. The technology wasn't advanced enough. Human anatomy wasn't suited for flight. Wind resistance would always win. Gravity was too strong. Engines were too weak. If the Wright brothers had chosen facts, they would have stopped before they started. But they didn't choose facts. They chose faith. Not religious faith, creative faith, visionary faith, inner knowing faith. The faith that whispers, there is more. Go find it. Their belief in possibility became stronger than the facts against them. Their conviction overpowered the evidence. Their inner vision became more real to them than what their eyes could see. And this single choice changed the world forever. Faith is what lifts you into realms facts cannot reach. Facts often hide behind logic, but faith carries revelation. Facts come from what the world knows. Revelation comes from what God shows. Facts require proof. Revelation requires obedience. Facts demand understanding. Revelation demands trust. One of the greatest spiritual truths is this: God does not speak to your logic. God speaks to your faith. When you feel a prompting, a desire, an idea, a vision, logic will say, "This doesn't make sense." But faith will say, "Move anyway." Because revelation always comes before understanding. Faith always comes before clarity. Obedience always comes before manifestation. Choosing faith over facts means choosing revelation over reasoning. Facts do not disappear. They simply lose their authority. Choosing faith does not mean denying facts. It means refusing to let facts decide your future. Facts say, "This is how things have been." Faith says, "This is how things will be." Facts say, "This is the limit." Faith says, "There is no limit." Facts say, "This is the pattern." Faith says, "Let's break it." When you choose faith over facts, facts don't vanish. They simply stop ruling your decisions. They stop defining your identity. They stop shaping your expectations. Instead, facts become tools, data that helps you understand where you are, not who you are. Faith speaks a different language. Logic speaks in statements. Faith speaks in vision. Logic says, "Be realistic." Faith says, "Be divine." Logic says, "What if it doesn't work?" Faith says, "What if it does?" Logic says, "You've never done this before." Faith says, "That's how breakthroughs happen." Logic says, "Look at the results." Faith says, "Look at the promise." Logic says, "It's impossible." Faith says, "It's already done." Faith speaks from the finished end. Faith speaks from the unseen. Faith speaks from the realm where God has already completed the work. Choosing faith means choosing to trust that what you feel within is more powerful than what you see around you. Faith requires movement, not agreement. Facts want negotiation. Facts want consensus. Facts want permission. Faith wants obedience. Faith does not need your logic to agree with it. Faith does not wait for proof. Faith does not require reassurance. Faith moves in spite of uncertainty. You choose faith over facts the moment you move in the direction of your vision without requiring evidence first. This is the decision that changes everything. Your spirit knows before your mind accepts. Facts inform your mind. Faith informs your spirit. And your spirit will always know your path long before your mind understands it. You feel the dream before you comprehend the details. You sense the calling before you can explain it. You feel the shift before you can justify it. You know the destiny before you can articulate it. This is why faith is the higher master. It speaks from divine knowledge, not human information. Choosing faith over facts means trusting the voice that knows who you really are. The world honors facts. God honors faith. The world gives awards for what has been achieved. God releases blessings for what has been believed. The world celebrates accomplishments. God celebrates obedience. The world trusts reports. God trusts vision. Choosing faith over facts puts you in alignment with the source, not the surface. It positions you for favor, acceleration, and miracles that make no logical sense. This chapter is the decision point. Up to this point in your journey, you've been awakening, remembering, unlearning. But now the decision must be made. Will you let facts continue to define your life? Or will you let faith begin to lead it? You cannot serve two masters. You cannot follow two voices. You cannot live by two laws. The Wright brothers chose faith, and humanity took flight. You choose faith, and your life will rise in the same way. Facts describe. Faith transcends. This is the moment you step into your true power. Chapter 12. Living Beyond Logic. To live beyond logic is not to reject logic. It is to rise above it. It is to step into a realm where your life is no longer directed by what has been, but by what can be. A realm where you no longer wait for evidence to believe. Instead, evidence arrives because you believed. Living beyond logic is living from your divine nature rather than your human conditioning. It is living from identity rather than experience, from vision rather than memory, from faith rather than fear. It is returning to the version of you that existed before the world taught you limitations. This is not a reckless life. This is not an irresponsible life. This is a spiritually aligned life. A life where faith, not logic, is the governing force. Living beyond logic means trusting what you feel more than what you see. Your senses show you reality. Your spirit shows you destiny. Logic says, look at the facts. Faith says, look at the future. The moment you begin living beyond logic, you shift from being reactive to being creative. You're no longer shaped by circumstances. Circumstances are shaped by you. Living beyond logic means you look at an obstacle and see an opportunity. You look at delay and see divine timing. You look at lack and see abundance forming. You look at closed doors and know another path is being prepared. Logic demands sight. Faith demands insight. People who live beyond logic follow the inner world more than the outer world. This is the level the Wright brothers chose. When Orville and Wilbur Wright stood on that windy beach at Kitty Hawk, they weren't just testing a machine. They were living beyond logic. Every fact was against them. Every expert doubted them. Every previous attempt had failed. Every calculation said they should stay grounded. But they trusted the unseen more than the seen. They trusted the vision more than the evidence. They trusted the inner knowing more than the physical conditions. They trusted the whisper that said, "Rise." And when they took flight, they proved a truth that is universal. Those who live beyond logic create what logic claims is impossible. This is your invitation. Not to fly physically, but to rise spiritually, mentally, financially, emotionally, creatively, to rise into the version of you that logic could never comprehend. Living beyond logic means making decisions from vision. When you live by logic, you ask, what makes sense? When you live by faith, you ask, what aligns with my destiny? These are two completely different questions that produce two completely different lives. Logic chooses comfort. Faith chooses calling. Logic chooses the familiar. Faith chooses the future. Logic chooses the safe path. Faith chooses the significant one. People who live beyond logic don't make decisions based on what is guaranteed. They make decisions based on what is divinely aligned. This is why their lives look miraculous to others. But to them, those miracles feel natural, because they are simply the result of choosing faith repeatedly. Living beyond logic requires identity, not effort. Most people try to live spiritually with mental effort. But living beyond logic is not about trying harder. It's about becoming clearer on who you are. You cannot consistently act above the identity you hold. If you believe you are limited, your decisions will reflect limitation. If you believe you are ordinary, your vision will shrink to match. If you believe you are defined by your past, you will repeat it. But when you know you are divine, when you know you are connected to infinite intelligence, your decisions reflect your true nature. You begin to think differently. You begin to speak differently. You begin to imagine differently. You begin to move differently. You stop consulting fear for permission. You stop asking logic for validation. You stop seeking proof before believing. You step into identity, and identity governs action. Living beyond logic means acting before the evidence appears. Faith is not passive. Faith is movement. Living beyond logic means you stop waiting for perfect conditions. You stop waiting for guarantees. You stop waiting for the right moment. You stop waiting for people to understand. You stop waiting for logic to agree. You act because you know. You move because you trust. You decide because you believe. Your actions become prophetic. They reveal the future you're walking into. Scripture says, "Faith without works is dead." Not because effort produces faith, but because movement activates faith. Living beyond logic means you start building the ark before it rains. You start gathering the vessels before the oil flows. You start preparing the runway before the plane takes flight. Living beyond logic breaks cycles. Every form of stagnation in your life, financial, emotional, spiritual, relational, comes from one source: logic leading instead of serving. Living beyond logic breaks generational cycles because you stop repeating what the past taught you. You stop following patterns rooted in fear. You stop honoring limitations handed down to you. Instead, you begin honoring possibility. You begin honoring vision. You begin honoring divine instruction. You begin honoring the whisper. And your entire life becomes a demonstration of what God can do through someone who is not bound by facts. Living beyond logic reveals a different world. Once you begin living this way, you start seeing miracles everywhere. You see opportunities others overlook. You see connections forming before they appear. You see abundance where others see scarcity. You see alignment where others see coincidence. You see growth in moments. Others see failure. Because faith changes the way you interpret everything. Your world doesn't just become better, it becomes bigger. Living beyond logic makes you unstoppable. There is nothing more powerful than a person who has stopped living by logic alone. They become unpredictable to the enemy, unstoppable by circumstances, and unlimited by history. They move with confidence. They move with clarity. They move with boldness. They move with spiritual authority, because they know something logic cannot comprehend. Their life is governed by vision, not by evidence, by destiny, not by data, by calling, not by calculation, by faith, not by facts. Living beyond logic is not a moment. It is a lifestyle. It is not an event. It is an identity. It is not a reaction. It is a posture. And once you embrace it, nothing in your life stays the same. Epilogue: Returning to the original you. In the end, this journey is not about becoming someone new. It is about remembering who you were before the world taught you doubt. It is about returning to the original you, the one who lived from faith without conflict, without hesitation, without fear. Before logic shaped your thinking, before experiences shaped your beliefs, before disappointment shaped your expectations, you were pure faith. You trusted the unseen without needing explanation. You moved toward desire without needing permission. You believed in possibility without needing evidence. You operated from a spiritual intelligence far greater than logic could ever comprehend. And throughout your life, faith never disappeared. It simply went quiet beneath the noise of logic, facts, and fear. But as you've moved through these chapters, something awakened. The whisper returned. The pull returned. The memory returned. Because faith is not something you learn. It is something you remember. The journey was never about logic versus faith. It was about mastery. The purpose of this book was not to villainize logic. Logic is a gift. It helps you solve problems, navigate life, understand patterns, and make sense of the world. The issue was never logic itself. It was logic as a master. You were never designed to be led by logic. You were designed to be led by faith. Logic is a tool. Faith is the architect. Logic builds the structure. Faith supplies the vision. Logic organizes the path. Faith chooses the destination. When logic becomes the master, your life shrinks. When faith becomes the master, your life expands. The return to your original self is the return to spiritual order. Faith leads. Logic follows. The Wright brothers completed this journey too. Their story is not simply a historical achievement. It is a spiritual blueprint. Two men, with no formal education, no support, no evidence, no logical reason to believe, heard the whisper of faith and chose to trust it. They allowed vision to outrank facts. They allowed intuition to outrank expertise. They allowed possibility to outrank probability. And in doing so, they returned to the part of themselves that still remembered. With faith, nothing is impossible. The Wright brothers didn't just build an airplane. They built a demonstration of spiritual law. When you choose faith as your master, the world must adjust to your belief. Human flight didn't become possible when the airplane lifted into the air. It became possible the moment someone believed it could. This is your story, too. Everything that seems impossible in your life is simply waiting for you to return to the one who once believed without resistance. Returning means releasing. To return to the original you must release what the world taught you. Release the fear disguised as logic. Release the doubts dressed as caution. Release the beliefs borrowed from others. Release the identity shaped by experiences. Release the ceilings created by facts. Release the limitations inherited from the past. None of these belong to you. None of these were present when you were born. None of these reflect your true nature. The spiritual journey is not adding more. It is removing what never belonged. Returning means trusting again. The original you trusted easily, not because the world made sense, but because your soul remembered its source. When you trust again, your life begins to flow again. Doors open again. Ideas come again. Alignment appears again. Opportunities rise again. Miracles return again. Trust is not something you earn. It is something you allow. Returning means creating from the inside out. The original you created reality from imagination, not circumstance. As a child, you saw the world as flexible, moldable, responsive to your thoughts. And that was the truth. But as logic grew louder, the world seemed fixed, solid, unchanging. That was the illusion. The return to faith breaks that illusion. You remember, life is not happening to you. Life is responding to you. You are not the effect. You are the cause. You are not the witness. You are the creator. You are not the follower. You are the visionary. Returning to the original, you means living from the inside out again. Returning means rising. To return is to rise. Rise above fear. Rise above fact. Rise above limitation. Rise above logic. Rise above the smallness the world tried to put on you. Your rise is not external, it is internal. You rise by remembering. You rise by believing. You rise by imagining. You rise by choosing. You rise when you step into the person faith knows you are. You are now ready. This journey has prepared you for the ultimate spiritual truth. Faith is not something you practice. Faith is something you are. Faith is your identity. Faith is your language. Faith is your nature. Faith is your power. Faith is your birthplace. Faith is your destiny. You entered this world in perfect faith. You are returning to that world again, but now with the wisdom, awareness, and maturity to wield that faith consciously. You are no longer the newborn who believes without understanding. You are the creator who believes by choice. This is not the end of the book. This is the beginning of your ascent. The original you has returned. The true you has awakened. The faithful you has risen. Now go live from the highest part of yourself. Not the part shaped by facts, but the part shaped by God. Thank you for listening. Thank you for listening. Please like and share.